Hi, I'm David Miller, and this is the fourth of 9 mini-lectures on Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Today we're going to follow up our look at the novel's opening sentence by discussing the relation between style and plot. Here's the outline. We'll start with an overview of the action in Volume 2 and then see how the idea of reading backwards works at the level of plot as well as style. Let's start our overview by going back to the map. The action of Volume 1 takes place entirely in Hertfordshire. When Bingley and company decamp to London, they don't just leave the neighborhood, they exit from the story, too. But Volume 2 moves the scene, first briefly to London, and then, for 6 weeks, to Hunsdon, in the Shire of Kent. Only in the closing movement do Elizabeth and Jane return to Longbourn. The shape of the action in Volume 2 falls into 4 roughly equal movements, just as it did in Volume 1. There's an opening movement, chapters 1 to 4, in which Jane goes to London with Mr. Bennet's brother and his wife, the Gardiners. Elizabeth and her companions stop to visit there on the way to see Charlotte and Mr. Collins in Hunsford. The second and third movements take place there, partly at the parsonage, that's the Collins' little home, partly at Rosings, the grand house of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and partly in Rosings Park, the private garden surrounding Lady Catherine's manor house. The second movement builds for 5 chapters, from Elizabeth's arrival through her first visit to Rosings, the arrival of Darcy and his cousin Fitzwilliam, and Darcy's first visit to the parsonage. The turning point between the second and third movements, which is also the turning point in the novel as a whole, comes in chapters 10 and 11. Colonel Fitzwilliam reveals to Elizabeth that it was Darcy who separated Mr. Bingley from Jane, and then Darcy, in a breathtaking display of bad timing, proposes to Elizabeth. She rejects him angrily. The third movement, which is also the longest, ends in chapter 15 with Elizabeth's departure on the journey back to Hertfordshire. The fourth movement returns us to Longbourn, ending with Elizabeth's departure on yet another trip, this time a visit to Derbyshire with the Gardiners. The symmetry of this pattern, with its brief opening and closing movements bracketing the long stay in Kent, is what we have by now come to expect. But to demonstrate just how symmetrical the design of the novel really is, let me ask you to get out your copy of the text, if you have it with you, and figure out how many total pages the novel takes up. You can pause the video while you check these things. The novel starts on page 3 and ends on page 266, so there must be 263 pages. Where would that make the midpoint? Half of 263 is 131.5. So the midpoint must come on page 134. Take a look. What's happening there? Elizabeth is just winding up her refusal of Darcy's first proposal, which, as I mentioned, is the turning point in the novel's plot. Okay, now one more math problem. If this is exactly halfway through the novel, where is the 1/4 mark? Setting aside the fractions, I make it to be page 68. And what's happening there? Elizabeth is just winding up her first dance with Darcy at the Netherfield ball, where he has surprised everyone by asking her to dance, and she, while they're dancing, upbraids him with his treatment of Mr. Wickham. This exchange directly foreshadows the rejected marriage proposal and the recriminations that follow. The symmetry of the novel's design illustrates how the qualities that mark Austen's style at the sentence level appear in its narrative design. Remember the balance and symmetry of that opening sentence? A single man balanced by a good fortune, in possession, poised against in want. The parallelism is part of the wit, as the sentence plays off the possession of a fortune against the want of a wife. But the balance isn't static. The phrases a single man and a good fortune are both adjective-noun combinations of 4 syllables, but the 2-syllable word shifts from the adjective spot, single, to the noun spot, fortune. Meanwhile, a good fortune, which I said is the pivotal phrase in the sentence, is balanced in a different way against a wife, because they are the objects of the parallel verb phrases in possession of and in want of. Here, though, the symmetry tips a little, for the wife has no adjective. She's not paired with anything except the verb want, to which she is linked by the alliteration of the W sound. This means that the sentence picks up speed at the end as it delivers the joke, and also that it reinforces the wife's relative poverty in the economic equation. It treats her as the accessory to a good fortune which she does not possess, and leaves her bringing up the rear without so much as a modifier to her name. In these ways, of course, the sentence is inviting that backward reading I talked about last week. Here's the diagram again. You may notice that I've switched the left and right-hand columns. I did this to suggest that the version Austin gives us may be viewed as the transformation of a suppressed alternative, as if we started out with a true version of the sentence and then translated it into the language of counterspeak, otherwise known as irony. This helps to visually reinforce the point, since for us to read backward is literally to read from right to left. I think Austin's sentence hints at this reading through the alliteration of the phrase "in want of a wife," because the way those two words are linked should remind us that it is the unmarried girl, the wannabe wife, who wants in every sense. She lacks, she needs, and she wishes. If we take this cue, we can start at the end of the sentence and read it backwards quite literally. We can read back up the page. And as we do, we can translate the sentence out of counterspeak and into plain English by reading backward, from right to left. When we do this, we come back to the beginning of the sentence and discover its greatest symmetry and its greatest reversal. The truth it proclaims in its opening phrase is an exact reversal of the want in its last phrase. We begin by reading "it is a truth," but then we encounter a turning point in the phrase "in want of a wife." When we literally turn back at that point, following the alliteration and the reversal of meaning it hints at, we come back to the beginning of the sentence to unmask its truth as a desire that declines to recognize itself as such, refuses to acknowledge its status as want. The opening sentence of Austin's novel contains an entire plot in miniature, complete with a turning point, a reversal, and a recognition of error. If this sounds a bit extravagant, if you think I'm making too much of the idea that this is a novel about reading, then consider what kind of event forms the actual turning point in the plot. For it isn't only Darcy's proposal and Elizabeth's rejection of him that triggers a reversal in the action. It is also, crucially, an act of reading, Elizabeth's reading of Darcy's letter. Austin spends a whole chapter describing how Elizabeth reads the letter, detailing how her first reaction leads to rereading and rethinking. She carefully takes us through the stages by which Elizabeth reverses her interpretation of the letter, and she makes it abundantly clear that this reversal of reading is what drives the reversal of action in the plot. When Elizabeth begins to change her mind about Darcy, when she learns to read him backward, the story has taken its crucial turn toward the happy ending that awaits us in Volume 3. Next time, we'll follow up on Elizabeth's reading of Darcy's character, in several senses of that very important word.